Before we jump into the theoretical discussion of the reinforcement of racial inequality and racism on different levels of analysis, I want to show you some concrete statistics that indicate the existence of racial disparity. I'm sure that later in this quarter, we will have more opportunity to get to know more similar statistics. So here is some statistics that indicates the existence of racial disparity within one social institution, education. And this is what scholars call as racial achievement gap. As we can see in the state where Santa Clara University is situated, there are salient racial achievement gap between white students and black students. And on average, this racial achievement gap is about 20 points. It became slightly narrower from 2011 to 2013, but still there is a very salient racial achievement gap. If we look at the racial achievement gap in another region, in another city, which is Washington, D.C., we can see that the racial achievement gap becomes even more salient. In 2011, on average, white students achieved 60 points higher score than their black classmates, and this racial achievement gap became slightly narrower from 2011 to 2013, but still, even in 2013, there were a 56-point differences between the achievement in math score of white students versus their black classmates. So what we can conclude from the observation of the racial disparity in education is that there is indeed a very salient racial disparity in two different places. We only look at two different places, but even by looking at the two different places, we can realize how salient the racial achievement score is. And the salient racial achievement score tells us the salience of racial inequality in one specific social institution, and a very important one. Education. So our question becomes, how should we understand the reinforcement of racial disparity? And more importantly, how should we combat racial inequality as scholars and students in sociology of race and ethnicity? So to answer these two questions, I want to help you to review something that we talked about in our Tuesday lecture, which is how to understand society from the angle of different levels of analysis. So in our Tuesday lecture, we said that if we look at a society from different levels of analysis, we can see social entities operating on different levels. Some social entities such as race is operating on a grand level, and we call race as social structure. Some social entities such as science, family, education are operating on a slightly lower level of analysis, and we call them as social institutions. Social institutions are constrained to some extent, or more or less constrained by the sociological logics of race. And on a more micro level analysis, we have we as individuals, and we as individuals engage with interactions with each other. To some extent, by and large, our interactions are constrained by the social institutions that we are affiliated with, and the social institutions that we are affiliated with are constrained by the social structures. So with this knowledge, let us look at the definition of individual racism. Our textbook author defined individual racism as, quotation mark, when one person discriminates against another on the basis of race or ethnicity. Earlier in this quarter, we talked about the differences and the similarities between racial prejudice and racial discrimination. We say that racial prejudice is something that exists on a perception level, so it is about whether a person has prejudice in their perceptions. Racial discrimination is something that translates the prejudice into behaviors and a treatment. It is about whether a person treats people differently according to their racial and ethnic identities. So now we have individual racism. Individual racism is about whether a person translates their perceptions into behaviors. And we know that racial prejudice and racial discrimination combined together is labeled as racism in the scholarly community. So the question that I often received from my previous experience of teaching this course is, earlier on, we introduced that colorblind racial ideology becomes the hegemonic racial ideology in our current society. So some students ask me, what does it mean that individual racism is declining in our society? This is actually a very excellent question, and it is a question that we as scholars are still trying to find out the answer. I will leave it as an open-ended question to you to decide whether and to what extent individual racism is indeed declining. And one thing that I want to highlight here is that the existence and manifestation of individual racism is sensitive to the context. So it is highly possible, highly probable that you have observed the declining of individual racism in one particular social institution and in one particular social context, but you have also observed the increasing salience of individual racism in another social institution and in another social context. But here, I want to present you with some scholarly evidence that support the existence of individual racism. And this scholarly evidence comes from a really excellent sociology study that is conducted by a group of sociologists. So this sociology study was published in a very renowned sociology journal. And these scholars utilize a particular sociological method that is called auditing study. So in the most simplified form, the auditing study means that this group of sociologists recruit participants to help them to conduct this study. And the recruited participants are similar in every other facet, in almost all the facets that we can imagine. So these participants are similar in terms of their gender, in terms of their height, their appearance, their educational attainment, their qualification. The only differences between these participants is their racial and ethnic identities. This group of sociologists send out the group of participants and ask them to apply for similar jobs. They then count the number of callbacks that these participants receive. And based on the design of their research, the disparity in the number of callbacks that these participants receive are the disparity that are attributed to individual racism between the employer and the job applicants. In this case, the job applicants are the research participants that this group of researchers recruited. As I illustrated on the graph here, there are salient differences in terms of the number of callbacks that the white participants, the white job applicants in this case, received versus the number of callbacks that the Latinx job applicants received versus the number of callbacks that black job applicants received. So this disparity, because of their study design, indicates the existence of individual racism within the interaction between the employer and the job applicants. This is the most simplified description of this study. I linked the full study in the comments below if you are interested in knowing more about how this group of scholars attributed disparities to the existence of individual racism. Please feel free to refer to the link of this study below. But my point is that, at least based on some studies, although colorblind racial ideology is perceived as the hegemonic racial ideology in our current societies, individual race, there is still strong evidence that supports the argument that individual racism still exists, at least in some social institutions and in some contexts in our societies. But if you have following through the lectures and the classes in the previous 3 weeks, you probably have already developed this understanding that individual racism alone does not fully explain the existence of racial disparity that I showed you in the educational system. So there are other social factors and other social forces that are participating in the reinforcement of racial disparity. What are they? To understand more about the process of reinforcement of racial inequality and racial disparities, let us get into the next video on the reinforcement of racial disparity on other levels of analysis.